So the bell ringer, we talked about what you learned about the challenges of the reforms in Canvas chats and in the AP7 media activity in a document where you typed in the 10 facts and 5 interpretations for each of those videos. In the second video in particular, they mentioned how some of the opposition to reform or opposition to the absolutism would end up erupting into the streets. And so today I wanted to look at that. I did want to just briefly go back to the Bourbon family because we talked about it in France, but we did not talk about it in the other place that it exists, which is in Spain. And that will coincide with the first thing we'll mention about revolutions. In Spain, the Bourbon family found its head in Ferdinand VII, who sat on the throne. And so this had been restored after Napoleon, of course, had gone away. And this family now controlled both France and Spain, neighboring countries. So Ferdinand VII enrolled ruling in 1820, but he soon found that not everyone living within the Spanish system would be pleased with that. So really the only support he had was the conservative order in the Congress of Vienna. The first problems for Spain, of course, began in Latin America. And it's not just, as they said in the video there, the colonists and the local people that had a problem with that. It obviously was also about competition. Both Britain and France in the past, as well as Portugal and Spain, had tried to have influence over the Western Hemisphere, particularly those warmer climates where they could grow a lot more cash crops. And in fact, the English were attempting to stop the increase of colonization in Spain. Even though they had all that territory throughout most of South America, for instance, in Central America, obviously it's in places like coastal cities and ports and mining areas. So they wanted to make sure that the Spanish weren't going to continue to increase colonization. And so the British also worked with the Americans in order to make that happen. Under President James Monroe, the United States established a doctrine known as the Monroe Doctrine, stating that the Western Hemisphere should be free from influence. Now, of course, the United States didn't really have the ability to enforce any of that. But nevertheless, that, along with some of the success that happened in the United States and France, is going to inspire the Spanish colonies to eventually revolt. In Greece, just the next year in 1821, they will see a revolution against the Ottomans. Britain, France, and Russia would actually help support the Greeks. For one, they wanted to see an end to Ottoman influence. And of course, Russia wants to have allies, of course, and access to warm waters. And so eventually, Greece wins independence, and Otto I is made the king of Greece. Nine years later, in 1830, Serbia is also able to achieve independence. Just a little bit further north in Greece, their quasi-independence is achieved after making a deal with the Ottoman Sultan. Because of their Orthodox heritage, they also are aligned with Russia. And this relationship will continue the whole way until World War I. In fact, it is one of the causes. Speaking of Russia, they also had their own pushes for reform, including in the army. Those that belonged to the Southern Society wanted to end serfdom and form a representative government. Those in the Northern Society favored a constitutional monarchy there. So they wanted to keep the Tsar, but they too also wanted to end serfdom. So that is one thing that a lot of reformers in Russia had in common. Eventually, Nicholas I becomes Tsar of Russia, but many people think that the Tsar position should have gone to his brother instead. And so some of the army officers, being confused about this, decided to stage a protest in what's commonly known as the Decembrist Revolt. But it is heavily mowed down by the loyal military officers and enlisted men, and it kills a number of people, including civilians. And after this, of course, Nicholas I decides to crack down heavily. Not that Russia was really that free to begin with, but there'll be a continued effort, czar after czar after czar, up until the last one, to kind of crack down on any type of criticism or calls for reform. And of course, they'll get a lot of support, in particular from the Orthodox Church, to enforce this mentality amongst the citizens that the Tsar is the true leader and there's no need to question him. So there's a close relationship between the Tsar and the Orthodox Church. Poland, however, was within Russia's sphere of influence, and in 1832, they will also try to rise up with a revolution to revolt against Russian rule. But, of course, Nicholas I isn't really having any of that in any part of influence under his leadership. Meanwhile, if we go back to France in the year 1830, once again, they kind of glossed over this in the video, but Charles X is the successor to the French throne, and he starts to restore some old tenets that people didn't necessarily approve of, that they mentioned in the video, including appointing a lot of ultra-royalist people to be in leadership positions. In response to this, as they mentioned in the film, there were protests and uprising, and people were afraid of a big challenge and possibly a new French Revolution. And so it was decided by Charles X and those also in the royal family that he would abdicate, and Louis Philippe would end up becoming king. So don't necessarily see it as the monarch family saying, oh, we've done terribly wrong, we need to be out of here. It was more like, well, we need to make a switch to trick people into thinking there was some kind of huge change, so that way they don't have a full-scale revolution again. So Louis Philippe became king, and he did offer some reforms, such as freedom of press and religion, but otherwise he was pretty conservative. He really didn't think too much of the working class people, and he continued to have territorial ambitions, expanding territory in North Africa. And just on a small note, Belgium actually declared its independence from Holland in 1830 and became its own kingdom, and will remain so until this day, despite some of their shared language issues. And except for being a doormat into France during the 20th century, it doesn't really come up that much anymore. But in Britain, of course, they're continuing to have issues when it comes to reform. Lord Liverpool has proposed allowing labor organizations to exist, earlier forms of unions, and greater economic freedom. And as they mentioned in the video there, the Whig Party, WHIG, ended up endorsing the idea of reforming their electoral system. making the elections of MPs or members of parliament a little bit more legitimate. Because as I said in there, the countryside with very few or maybe no people had representatives, whereas big cities that were newer as in they'd been around for only 100 years or had size for 100 years or so, they didn't have any representatives. So they tried to change that to some extent. They also allowed Catholics to be elected to Parliament. And expanded who could vote with the Great Reform Bill. In the meantime, in South America, the video had already mentioned Simon Bolivar. Another one would be Jose de San Martin. And San Martin is spelled S-A-N. Second word, M-A-R-T-I-N. Martin led independence movements in Chile and Peru. Bolivar in other parts of Latin America, including Venezuela. In Mexico, a man by the last name of Iturbide, I-T-U-R-B-I-D-E, I-T-U-R-B-I-D-E, declared Mexico independent from Spain in 1821 and is eventually made their emperor. That's a pretty simplistic looking at the beginning of the independence of Mexico, but actually it will go back and forth. Around the time of the American Civil War, they're eventually conquered by France because of large amounts of debt they owe, and so they had to have independence again. So Mexico is a country that actually has multiple independence days. Brazil, in the meantime, decided that they wanted to be free from Portuguese influence. Dom Pedro, P-E-D-R-O, became the emperor of Brazil in 1822. And a peaceful revolution there encouraged their independence from Portugal. But this would just be some of the first wave of revolutionary activity. Obviously, it will continue on as the last ones, as you pointed out in the video, take place in 1848. Despite all these revolutions and reform movements, though, it's important to remember, even though there are challenges and weak points, once again, there isn't another large-scale war that takes place, and most of the people in charge remain in charge. So the conservative order is maintained despite some of these reforms and revolutions. So for the remainder of the period, you can, of course, work on the reading, or if you didn't finish up all the sections of the midterm, make sure that you do that, please. Today is the last day of the grading period. And you can also work ahead if you wish.